Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, I tell you, comrades, I'm going to negotiate with the IMF on the basis of our existing policies, not changes in policies. It means sticking to the very painful cuts in public expenditure on which the government's already decided. That's what it means, and that's what I'm asking for. That's what I'm going to negotiate for, and I ask the conference to support me in that task.
Denis Healey was often described as the best Prime Minister Labour never had. Born in the First World War, a distinguished soldier in the Second, he held many of the toughest jobs in politics. But he never quite reached the top of the greasy pole, though he was often seen as the most gifted politician of his generation.
Denis stood out because of his special combination of brain and brawn. Nobody combined muscularity in the little grey cells to such devastating effect as Denis.
Denis was a loner. He was not a schmoozer, he was a counter-schmoozer. And that, I think, was one of the main reasons that he never became Prime Minister.
When I was a student communist, we often used to debate the question, who will do the dirty work under socialism? And of course, I found out in later life it was Denis Healey.
Denis Healey was a politician with a hinterland. He loved music and poetry and literature and was a talented pianist, painter and photographer. But he was also a key player in many of the 20th century's most turbulent events. Healey was Defense Secretary during the Cold War with the Russians and the American War in Vietnam. As Chancellor in the 70s, he introduced uncompromising austerity policies in return for a bailout deal with the IMF, and he cut annual public spending much further in real terms than the Cameron coalition managed.
We got the deal through, and from that moment on, I was walking on water. The international community thought I was the best thing since sliced bread. The American journal Institutional Investor had a cover story of the 5 best chancellors in the world, and I came top, and all the other 4 were working in dictatorships. And as I've always said, it's not difficult to be a finance minister in a country where you can use electrodes applied to the sensitive parts of the body as means of persuading recalcitrants.
Healey's political career was one long tribal battle for the soul of the Labour Party. The student communist had converted himself into a zealous bare-knuckle fighter against the Labour left.
These people continually accused the last Labour government, of which some of them were unprotesting members, of betraying the electorate. And they used barefaced lies to support their campaign of vilification.
If you were fighting for the soul of the Labour Party against Denis, it would be absolutely infuriating. The greatest duffer-upper of them all.
The great bruiser of the Labour Party retired from frontline politics over 20 years ago to his home in Sussex, which he described as his earthly paradise. At the time, I made a TV profile of Healey and filmed a number of interviews with him and his wife.
It's a nice place you've got here.
Yeah.
There are people in the Labour Party who would say, what's he doing living in a house like this?
Well, they say that about television presenters, don't they, and pop stars.
Somebody once said to me, if a Chancellor of the Exchequer at the end of his career can't live in a decent house, what hope is there for the rest of us?
Denis Healey was a man of contradictions. He combined a classical pianist's sensitivity with the style of a stand-up comic.
This is Mrs. Thatcher's theme song.
With his famous eyebrows, Healy was a gift for the cartoonists, and for the impressionist Mike Yarwood, who helped make him one of the most popularly recognised politicians in the country. And the real Denis Healey even appeared on Yarwood's show.
Hello, I'm Denis's sister.
No, of course you'd never think it, would you?
I'm Denis.
I'm Denise. He's a menace.
He's a tease.
That's Denis.
That's Denise. Oh, what a silly filly.
Of course, all this is a front. Denis is essentially a very private person, a very sensitive person. You wouldn't think so from the way in which he twiddles these eyebrows and does all this jolly act when he goes around the streets and so on and makes himself like a tremendous, jovial big figure. And that isn't the real Denis.
The real Denis was a lone wolf. Rather than creating a group of Healyites in the Labour world of factions, he seemed to prefer a carapace.
I haven't built a shell, but I have, in a sense, tried to preserve a personal life with my family and friends, and to preserve a space, if you like, for my love of poetry and music and literature. And the one thing I would never do is allow politics to destroy that space, because I think it would destroy me as a human being, and I've seen politics destroy human beings. And I suppose I've been a loner in a sense, that I've never tried to organize a group of people to achieve an objective for myself personally. I've never been a plotter.
He wasn't an easy man. Quite a lot of his fellow politicians gave him a fairly wide berth. He could be very dismissive. He could say, well, that's not an interesting idea, or that's not going to get us anywhere. He was not a schmoozer, he was a counter-schmoozer, if that's a possible phrase. A lot of people had the feeling that Denis didn't think you were really up to it, you weren't quite good enough. And they didn't like that. They were second-rate people who wanted to be appreciated as first-rate people. And Denis wouldn't make that mistake.
Born in 1917, Denis Winston Healey, who had Irish blood, grew up in Yorkshire. He'd been given his middle name by his father, who felt sorry for Winston Churchill after the naval disaster of the Dardanelles. Both his parents were schoolteachers.
From quite a little boy, he was always sure he was right. And if he argued, he never got cross or angry, but he'd just walk away and he was sure he was right.
Well, I think that may well be true. Though Mother often forgot things, or she idealized what happened. I mean, she once told an interviewer that I could read fluently when I was 2 years old. Absolutely untrue.
Healey's father, who became a headmaster, tended to treat Denis and his younger brother as if they were his pupils.
He never had a very easy relationship, I think, with me and my brother Terry, because he used to disguise a real warmth, perhaps intolerably warm feeling for his children, through a sort of brutal facetiousness.
A brutal facetiousness?
Yeah.
I sometimes think that might be a sort of description of some of the way that you behave.
Oh, we inherit a lot from our parents. You know, Larkin wrote a very good poem about that, which I'm not allowed to quote on the television.
Which was bowdlerized, "They tuck you up, your mum and dad."
That's exactly so.
In 1936, Healey won a scholarship from Bradford Grammar School to Balliol College, Oxford. Balliol, where Healey was to take a double first in classics, produced 3 prime ministers in the 20th century. The Liberal H.H. Asquith and the Conservatives Harold Macmillan and Ted Heath. Heath had been the college organ scholar and Healey's contemporary. Do you think there is something that Balliol gives you that helps you to become Prime Minister?
Oh yes, complete mental control, intellectual control. That's the first thing you learn about when you get here.
At Balliol, Ted Heath, who'd lived a sheltered life in Broadstairs, became a friend of Healy, his fellow grammar school boy.
Ted was not very worldly, and he was very innocent in a way in his attitude towards women. I mean, I always remember walking with him in the quad, very hot June day, and I happened to mention that some mutual friend had gone off to Bibury with his girl for the weekend. And Ted looked at me in alarm and said, "You don't mean to say they're sleeping together?" I said, "I suppose so. I don't know. I didn't ask." He said, "Good heavens, I can't imagine anybody in the Conservative Association doing that."
Were they both Conservatives?
At Oxford, Healy was anything but a Conservative. He joined the Communist Party and went on this peace march in London. The youth marchers wanted Soviet Russia to join with the West in a popular front against Nazi Germany. They dismissed reports about the brutal reality of Soviet communism as capitalist propaganda.
I was misguided about communism, of course. But if you ask me if I regret joining the Communist Party, I would reply with George Kennan. I'd much rather do something to stop Hitler than sit around picking lint out of my navel.
Healy joined the Royal Engineers when the war broke out. He was still a communist, but resigned from the party in protest against the Russians signing a non-aggression pact with Hitler. Healy was a beachmaster at Anzio, directing the Allied landings. He'd become used to being under fire.
Not panic-stricken. I mean, if you're being dive-bombed, you're bloody well frightened. I mean, if you've got something coming out of the sun on you with its wings screaming, obviously you're frightened, but it didn't interfere with what I did. That was the important thing.
As Healy and his men fought their way up through central Italy, they increasingly felt they'd become the forgotten army. To them, Italy was far from being the soft underbelly of Europe.
We were infuriated when Lady Astor, who was a Conservative MP, called us D-Day Dodgers, and a very good poem was invented, which was quite rude about Lady Astor and people who thought like her. We're the D-Day Dodgers out in Italy. We hope the boys in France will soon be getting leave. After 6 months' service, it's a shame they're not relieved. But we can still carry on out here for another 2 or 3 more years. For we're the D-Day Dodgers out in Italy. If you look around the mountains in the mud and rain, you'll find the scattered crosses. I'm sorry, you see, there it goes. I'm afraid I get too moved by these things. If you look around the mountains in the mud and rain, you'll find the scattered crosses, some which bear no name. Heartbreak and toil and suffering gone, the lads beneath them slumber on. But they were the D-Day Dodgers who'll stay in Italy. You know, that sort of poetry may not stand up to Palgrave's Golden Treasury, but there's genuine feeling there, and you can get it, don't you think?
Denis knew what wars did to people. That generation had this never again impulse. Never again slump, never again war. If you'd stood there on beaches like that in circumstances like those, a financial crisis was an absolute nightmare, but it wasn't the end of the world. If you literally had been under shot and shell for hours, and many, many times, and fighting up the spine of Italy in that terrible winter that he never forgot and was always very moving about, I think it did mean that in the financial and the political shot and shell, you were much better placed to cope.
I'm gonna get lit up when the lights go up in London. I'm gonna get lit up as I've never been before.
At the end of the war, Major Healy married a young woman he'd first met as an Oxford student. Edna Edmonds had become a school teacher like his own parents in Healy's Yorkshire hometown.
We fell in love and unfortunately missed 5 years' marriage allowance because I didn't have the sense to propose to her in 1940, waited till 1945.
Denis has this extraordinary energy, and you learn right at the beginning, really, that you've got rather an extraordinary one there. And that you better watch it, or, you know, it could be difficult.
Healy painted this watercolour of his young wife. They soon started a family and were to have 2 daughters and a son. At the end of the war, Major Healy, who joined the Labour Party, made his first ever conference speech as Labour was elected to government.
I made a fiery speech in uniform. I said a thing I deeply regret since, that the upper classes in Europe were dissolute, depraved and decadent.
Healy was congratulated by a fellow delegate for his wonderful gift for vituperation.
When you are arguing with people politically, I wonder whether you feel you sometimes leave them shattered because of your gift for vituperation.
Yes, I think that's true, and I think it's a fair criticism to make of me that I do tend sometimes to hurt people unnecessarily. I think perhaps something I may have inherited a little bit from my father, who didn't mean to do it, and I don't mean to do it when I do it.
Healy became Labour's foreign policy advisor and was elected a Leeds MP in 1952. Now on the right of the party and fiercely anti-communist, he was invited onto a BBC programme to question a former comrade.
And we are here to ask questions of John Gollan as the Secretary of the British Communist Party.
Could I give you a specific example, Gollan? Now, one of the things that puzzles me about the Communist Party is that it doesn't only kill its opponents from time to time, but it kills its own leading members. During the 1935 purges of the army, 80% of all the generals in the Red Army were shot for espionage and treason. Now, this was stated by the Russian leaders.
Which Russian leader stated this?
This was published in Pravda, my dear chap.
I'm afraid not, my dear
Certainly.
I didn't know I was such a smart young lad in those days.
You were very, very tough on him. It looked like
I was.
I mean, the toughness of the convert.
People say that, but I'm tough to everybody. I'm just as tough to Conservatives I disagree with, and to some of my Labour colleagues.
Burn the bomb! Burn the bomb!
In the mid-50s, the growth of the Ban the Bomb campaign fueled a new struggle for the soul of the Labour Party. Labour left-wingers like Michael Foot were convinced that Britain should unilaterally renounce its nuclear weapons. Denis Healey and the right believed the CNDers were starry-eyed idealists, and he was determined to tell them what they didn't want to hear. At Labour's conference, Healey confronted the left and revealed what he'd learnt at first hand from a meeting with the Soviet leader, Mr. Khrushchev.
He said, "We don't want our grandchildren to call us fools. Do you want your grandchildren to call you fools?" The Russians, the plain fact is, they've said so. Khrushchev has said so in public, do not believe in unilateral nuclear disarmament. They believe in multilateral nuclear disarmament, like the Labour Party.
Harold Wilson was the new Prime Minister after Labour's 13 years in opposition, and he made Denis Healey Defence Secretary. The ex-communist, who was used to doing battle with the left, now confronted the establishment in the form of an almost impossibly grand figure. Admiral Lord Mountbatten of Burma. He was the long-time chief of the defence staff. Known to his friends as Dickie, he'd been the last Viceroy of India and was the Queen's cousin.
He was also very arrogant, and he operated very much through a little personal court of officers of all 3 services in whom he had confidence and who'd worked with him for a long time. But at the same time, he had this extraordinary and rare ability of being able to simplify a problem to its essentials, and providing his judgment wasn't distorted by his vanity, I think his judgment on the whole was good.
Despite Healey's qualified respect for Lord Mountbatten's judgment, Within a year, Mountbatten was on his way out of the MOD. He'd been shown the door by Healy.
And I consulted 40 people in the services and the civil service in the department to find out what their view was, and all except one thought that he should go. And so I told Dickie that, and he claimed to be delighted, but his eyes told a different story.
How difficult was it for you to tell Mountbatten that he should go? I mean,
Well,
he was a formidable figure.
You have a lot of difficult things to do in life.
Denis decided that Mountbatten had done a terrific job, but it was time for a change, and that was it. That was it. I don't think Denis was in awe of anybody, really, except EDNA, and certainly not a chief of the defence staff. Denis was self-confident as a Secretary of State for Defence because he'd studied foreign and defence policy and he'd been on the beaches. It meant that in terms of dealing with the chiefs of staff, he didn't have a cringe because he'd been under shot and shell as well, and they knew that. They respected him.
Healy became a formidable Whitehall warrior in fighting the MOD's corner against the Treasury. He brought British troops home from trouble spots east of Suez as the empire was wound down. And he managed to bring a peaceful end to Britain's lengthy military conflict with Indonesia.
That, I think, was a model campaign, and especially by contrast with the tragic catastrophe of American strategy in Vietnam, which was going on at the same time.
The Labour government's support for the American war in Vietnam was hugely controversial in Britain. And as Defence Secretary, Denis Healey became a target for anti-war demonstrators. Though he privately deplored America's military methods, he was now a hate figure for the left, who called him Hitler Healey. But Healey wasn't prepared to speak out against the Americans.
I don't think us speaking out would have made any difference, and of course the Americans deeply resented that we didn't give them physical support.
But you never, as Defence Secretary, ever,
well, of course
ever
not,
spoke
my
out.
dear boy. You don't, as Defence Secretary, speak out against an allied government which your own government is supporting. Of course I did.
Even if you were convinced that what they're doing is completely wrong?
Oh, yes, I did it in private.
Could you move a little bit towards the end of the bench?
Being back in opposition gave Healy, Ted Heath's old Balliol friend, more time to polish his skills as an amateur photographer. And the man who'd been seen as a dry technocrat at defence set about humanising his own political image.
In many ways, I felt my job as the Secretary of State for Defence was rather like having a love affair with an elephant. It involved a great deal more pain than pleasure. I was in constant danger of being overlaid. And if I ever did conceive a good idea, you know, it took 27 months to bring it to birth.
Healy was becoming better known in opposition than he'd been in government.
This, of course, is inevitably a useful thing for a politician, but none of that is half as nice as taking decisions which have some meaning for the country. I always feel as a shadow minister very much like Achilles, who was met, you remember, by Odysseus in hell, in the old Greek fable of the Odyssey. And Odysseus asked him what he felt about it, and Achilles said, "I'd rather be the meanest swineherd on earth than king of all the shadows." And I feel that very much too.
But King Harold and all his shadows were now split down the middle over Europe. The left were passionately against the common market, and the right were passionately pro. The right thought Healy would side with them and support Ted Heath's mission to take Britain into the common market. But Healy succeeded in alienating all sides by changing his mind no fewer than 3 times on Europe.
I was never keen on the common market. Indeed, I was hostile at the beginning. But I think my main problem was that at a time when the party was split into 2 violently hostile camps, I took a very agnostic view, and of course it did me no good at all.
What it looked like from the outside was as if you were against the common market, in favour of it, and then you changed your mind. And one of your political colleagues said that you'd said to him, I've always ratted on the common market, but I've always done it at the wrong time.
I might well have said that because I'm liable to make humorous remarks, which sometimes hang like albatrosses round my neck.
In 1972, the albatross man was made shadow chancellor and seemed to revert to his pre-war Marxist roots.
We're going to introduce a tax on wealth. I warn you, there are going to be howls of anguish from the 80,000 rich people who are rich enough to pay over 75% on the last slice of their income. Comrades, the battle begins here in this hall this week. Let us make sure we win it.
Healy had achieved his aim of becoming an instantly recognisable public figure. He'd taken on the time-honoured role of the Labour bogeyman of the moneyed classes as the country was descending into ungovernable chaos. The miners had gone on strike as oil prices soared. There was a major fuel crisis which led to blackouts as Heath imposed a 3-day week on the country to save energy. In February '74, Heath called a snap general election and lost. Harold Wilson was back as head of a minority Labour government, and Healy became Chancellor with the economy in dire straits and the government in constant danger of defeat in the Commons.
You'd be surprised how many people have said to me in the last few months, I wouldn't have your job for £1 million. Why on earth do you want to be Chancellor of the Exchequer at a time like this? Well, I see what they mean. This certainly isn't a time when any Chancellor can win easy applause and still do his duty to the country.
With inflation running out of control, the new Chancellor prepared his first budget. He knew there could be a fresh general election at any time, and he sought not to frighten the voters.
Denis Healey, Labour's Chancellor of the Exchequer, takes a breather in the country before presenting one of the most important budgets in Britain's checkered economic history. It comes with the biggest deficit on the balance of payments of all time, and when our economy is sick, some experts think, almost to the point of dying. The budget puts 3 pence on basic income tax, clubbers the better off, increases the price of smokes, sweets, drinks, petrol, railway fares, postage, coal and electricity, but increases pensions and social benefits and takes a penny off milk. It's designed, says Mr. Healy, to make Britain a fairer place to live in.
Harold Wilson called a fresh general election in October '74. The Chancellor was wheeled out to claim that he'd cut inflation sharply to just 8.4%, rather than a much higher figure that was generally accepted.
I don't think he was, I put this carefully, I don't think he was a man who felt totally dedicated to the factual truth, if I can put it that way. Partly, I think that was his experience in the war and his experience with intelligence, you know, where, as we all know, there's a certain amount of manipulation of the truth. Denis was quite capable of that. That might have been part of the totalitarian streak in his mind. That's true. But again, I think that deep down he always knew what the truth was, but he was able to make a completely cynical judgment about whether it would be useful to abandon it for a short while. And I think that in the '74 election that must have been true.
The Chancellor's massaged figures helped Labour hold on to power, but with just a tiny majority.
Right, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, sir.
And Healy had his work cut out as the true rate of inflation soared. He would go to work each day on an egg or two fried by his wife, Edna.
I used to say that I laid the dining room table for the red box as well, because Denis worked through meals always.
You were given a high cholesterol breakfast to set you off on your...
The great thing about cholesterol, as I discovered, fortunately, late in life, is that cholesterol is like many other things. Some people are very vulnerable to high cholesterol. Others, like I am not. I mean, I drink 2 pints of milk every day, and I love fried things.
And you've had no trouble with your heart?
No, I've had no heart trouble, oddly enough. Though you never know.
Harold Wilson suddenly stunned the political world in 1976 after 2 years back in office. With inflation ballooning as wages and prices rose by an unprecedented 30%, Wilson announced that he was resigning and Labour MPs would elect a new Prime Minister. As Chancellor, Healy should have been one of the top favourites for the job, but the leadership election had come at the worst possible time for him because of a fight in the night. He'd lost his temper in the Commons in a blazing row with left-wing MPs.
I was up in the press gallery, and the Labour left had revolted. Denis was abusing them, and they were abusing Denis. Denis had this amazingly combative temperament, you know. Who else is in the bar? I'll take you all on in one go.
I think what happened is that one of them cast doubt on my fraternity, so I praised his virility, but it got into the press, this exchange of compliments.
What actually happened was that the left-wing MPs called Healy a Stalinist bastard, and Healy yelled at them, "You F-worders, you're out of your tiny Chinese minds."
You had some very harsh words for your party's left wing last week and were in turn called a barroom brawler. Doesn't all this damage your chances a great deal with the left?
Well, we have a very turbulent and boisterous love life in the Labour Party, you know, and these hard words get exchanged from time to time, and the bruises wear off quite quickly.
Not, I think, that Denis could have ever won, whether he'd insulted the left wing or not. I mean, they really disliked him intensely.
It didn't, in fact, make me unpopular with the left of the party, but I think did scare a lot of middle-of-the-road MPs.
If Denis could only have a sprinkler system inside him that he could turn on when the engines of combativeness were starting up, he would have been leader. But he couldn't help himself.
The avuncular Jim Callaghan won the leadership election, and he kept Healy on as Chancellor, who presented a brave face as the country lurched towards economic disaster.
We're now in a better position to achieve our economic miracle than any time since the war.
Do you think that the pound is now basically out of trouble?
My own view is it will settle at a rate which will hold for quite a long time.
2025, out of stock, Sorry?
But the money markets were losing faith in Healy's ability to control inflation and public spending. As he set off from the Treasury in the autumn of '76, he was blissfully unaware of the gathering storm. He was due to fly off to an international meeting when the speculators launched a massive attack on the pound.
Change it, change. It dropped 100 points. We don't know why. It just dropped 100 points when everything else was staying steady.
The only time I was really shaken as a minister was that famous day when the pound collapsed and I had to turn back from the airport to deal with it rather than go on to the Philippines, where I'd have been out of touch with Whitehall for 17 critical hours. And I felt the world was collapsing round me.
To bail Britain out, the Treasury applied for a huge loan from the International Monetary Fund, and Healy drove up to Blackpool to confront his sceptical party.
I'm going to negotiate with the IMF on the basis of our existing policies. But when I say existing policies, I mean things we don't like as well as things we do like. It means sticking to the very painful cuts in public expenditure on which the government's already decided. That's what it means, and that's what I'm asking for. That's what I'm going to negotiate for, and I ask the conference to support me in that task.
He shouted at the conference bawled at him. It was actually a very, very wise thing to do, because quite apart from it showing the courage the man had, what it did was to prove to the non-elected leaders of the IMF that he wasn't simply inventing the fact that he was taking an extremely difficult position in a country which was very unsympathetic to the IMF and to what it was proposing.
The IMF inspectors arrived to go through the government's books. As the price of their bailout, they demanded slashing public spending cuts. Healy knew that any deal he could reach would have to win the support of his fellow cabinet ministers, who were themselves deeply split. The hard left Tony Benn wanted Britain to set up a siege economy and have nothing to do with the IMF. Ministers from the right, like Shirley Williams, were more persuadable.
So from the beginning of September 76 to the beginning of December, it was monstrously difficult and uncertain, and a Labour cabinet that split into at least 4 groups. And Denis had to be the rock-solid one. He had to speak truth unto power, as it were. He had to bring reality to the cabinet table several times a week. And there were many around that cabinet table that didn't want reality. They were telling themselves fairy stories.
With the cabinet deadlocked, Healy sought to persuade the IMF to soften their terms.
He negotiated with the IMF. He went much further than his brief. He threatened the negotiators that if they didn't agree on what it was he was ready to go for, and which he and I had discussed, then we would have a general election. He got no authority to say that. And I was staying in Leeds that night. He came out to his constituency, which of course is Leeds. He told me, he said, we're going to have a general election. I said, oh, thank you very much. But I didn't mind because I knew it was a negotiating tactic.
The proof of the pudding is in the eating, isn't it?
And what was the proof of the pudding in this case?
Well, they dropped the demand for the extra billion. We got the deal through, and from that moment on, as you know, I was walking on water.
But Healy's triumph was short-lived. He and Jim Callaghan sought to curb public sector pay, but ran head-on into union power. The public service workers came out on strike across the country in what became known as the Winter of Discontent. Hospital patients were turned away, the dead were left unburied, and the rubbish went uncollected as public services and transport ground to a halt.
Don't forget how the people out on strike are suffering. They're living on bloody £6 a week strike payments. People laugh and joke, but they are living on bread and jam.
I felt extremely depressed, obviously. It was a terrible, terrible time. All of us in the cabinet were deeply worried about it. We could see that it was an economic disaster. It was likely to be a political disaster.
The first woman Prime Minister moved into number 10 just after Denis Healey's piano had been carried out of number 11.
The outgoing Mr. Denis Healey was making what he considered a temporary departure from number 11.
Oh, yes, but I know we'll be back.
Did it occur to you then how long Labour was going to be out of office?
No, it didn't. I think the striking thing really is that if you look back on my life as an active Labour politician from 1945, it's now nearly 45 years, and 20 of those 45 years have been wasted by the Labour Party in fighting itself rather than fighting the Conservatives.
With Labour in opposition, the party reverted to its default setting of internecine warfare. In the vanguard of the new battle was Tony Benn, the smiley-faced leader of the hard left. He claimed that ordinary party members had been systematically betrayed by Denis Healey and his fellow Labour right-wingers.
They have nothing to offer. And if you want to know what the real unwritten news story of the last few years is, it is that the right wing of the Labour Party are bankrupt.
Leading right-wingers like Shirley Williams and Dr. David Owen were threatening to break away and set up a new party if Benn came out on top. They hoped that when Jim Callaghan threw in the towel and resigned as leader in 1980, his successor would be Denis Healey. Healey began the leadership election, in which only MPs could vote, as the favourite.
I think it'll go well.
Do you think it'll be close?
I've no idea. I was the man most likely to win, unless the left could agree on a single candidate against me.
Benn had made a tactical decision to bide his time and not stand for the leadership. Instead, Michael Foot, Labour's old romantic, became the left's prime candidate. But the Bennites saw Foot as a short-lived caretaker as they launched a concerted campaign. They aimed to shift power to the grassroots and make right-wingers feel less than welcome in the party.
A lot of people in our movement really are frightened now. It's not easy to go along and be bawled down and shouted at and abused and intimidated and told you're just a bloody Tory.
It's not easy, and a lot of people in our movement are having to run that gauntlet day after day. They know, and I know too.
To anyone who aspires to lead this Labour Party, it will have to be a fight of passion and conviction. We're fed up with the fudging and the mudging. We're fed up with slush and mush. We want courage, fight, conviction, and hard work.
It was a really horrid time. It was a sort of party civil war. Many members looked to Denis, the bully and the battler, as their natural leader. They thought of Denis as a sort of Sir Galahad, a white knight, one who would take on the far left and never turn back.
But Denis Healey was profoundly to disappoint right-wing MPs who saw him as their saviour. He decided that as favourite, his best chance was to do and say next to nothing publicly, believing the leadership would fall into his lap. Some right-wingers like David Owen felt Healey no longer had the stomach for a stand-up fight with the left. Healey's low-profile strategy was to do him no good, and he lost to Michael Foot.
The defeat of Denis Healey was rather easier than any of us anticipated. He simply wouldn't invest the time and the tolerance of fools enough to win enough votes to win against Michael.
Well, I'm disappointed, but I shall go on working for the party, and I hope as deputy leader.
The left had always wanted to stop Healy, and they were very powerful. I made a lot of enemies as Chancellor because I had to do such unpleasant things.
Thank you. Thank you. Good night. Good night.
But Tony Benn and other hard-left activists like Ken Livingstone worked on a secret plan to promote Benn's leadership ambitions by first taking on Denis Healey. At 3 in the morning at Westminster, Benn revealed he would be standing against Healey for the deputy leadership under new rules which now shared the vote between MPs, party members and the unions. Denis Healey realised the new rules favoured Benn, and he had to take him on in a campaign of meetings across the country. He wanted to counter the key accusation that Tony Benn was making on the stump.
Go on, Tony.
Benn claimed that Healey, his ex-cabinet colleague, and other right-wing ministers were the guilty men in past Labour governments.
We would be mad if we didn't recognise that the last 5 Labour governments, when it came to the crunch, were they really going to implement the manifesto and defend the interests of those who elected them, or to capitulate to the forces of capital, I'm afraid, on certain key questions, withdrew under the pressure from the bankers, the common market, multinationals, and the Americans. And that's what the cuts in '76 were about from the IMF, and that's what led to the winter of discontent. That's what led ultimately to the disenchantment.
These people continually accuse the last Labour government, of which some of them were unprotesting members, of betraying the electorate. They do their best to undermine confidence in the current party leadership, and they use barefaced lies to support their campaign of vilification.
Benn's supporters, who included a very motley group, the anarchists, the Socialist Workers' Party, the International Marxist Group, Militant Tendency, even the positists who believed that socialism would be brought to the world by superior beings from outer space who had great technological ability, typical Bennites, I suppose. They came and howled me down at conference after conference.
And swelling anger against the fact that 150,000 men and women
Don't some of you who've been yelling understand you're playing the Tory game when you play that sort of game?
And of course it made appalling television.
Made very good television.
It made good television from a television journalist's point of view, but it turned people off the party. And I found it very difficult to understand how Tony, who had done nothing whatever to discourage this behaviour, could describe that sort of election as a healing process.
I'm in favour,
very briefly,
I'm
because
in
we
favour
have half
of
a
free
minute
speech.
left.
But first of all, Tony is not telling the truth, and he knows it. He mustn't tell lies, because he knows that to be
You've
untrue.
been saying it for months.
After 6 months of the most bitterly divisive internal election in Labour's history, delegates to the annual conference waited tensely for the result. Among them was Neil Kinnock, who'd organised a number of his fellow left-wing MPs to abstain from voting in protest against the hard-left Ben.
When those results were coming in, I thought, I wish I'd voted for Healy. Why have I inflicted this lack of certainty on myself? Because I knew it was extremely close. It turned out to be closer than anybody could imagine.
Chairman, comrades, Danny Mangum, Dyers Bleachers Textile Workers, Chief Teller. The final decision, and the votes have been counted 3 times. Tony Benn, 49.574. Denis Healey, 50.426.
Healy had won by an eyebrow, but later that night, Ben's supporters in the hard left claimed it was they who'd gained the victory.
3 years ago, Denis Healey was the next leader of the Labour Party, the next Labour Prime Minister. No one today can have any illusions about the change that has taken place in the Labour Party. The shift has become irreversible.
I fought much harder to have the meaningless job of deputy leader than the meaningful job of leader, because I thought Tony Benn would have killed the party forever if he'd won, and I think most people would share that view.
Healy was now yoked at the top of the party with a veteran left-winger who'd spent his career campaigning in favour of almost everything that Healy was against. In particular, Foote was a passionate ban-the-bomb supporter.
Don't you love the ideological bands here? Don't you love the CFD on Prosper? They're lovely. Ideological bands.
In the 1983 general election, Foote and Healy came up with a classic fudge, which seemed to turn Healy into a nuclear disarmer while allowing him a tiny bit of wriggle room.
Your own friends say that period inflicted deep psychological wounds on you.
I don't think I show any signs of deep psychological wounds, do you? Politics in a democracy means a compromise on issues on which you feel strongly, and of course I've come under enormous criticism for some of the compromises I've had to make.
I just wondered how difficult it was for you,
well, my dear
fighting
boy,
on that sort of fudge.
It was difficult, but it doesn't create great psychic wounds in me, for God's sake. You know, I'm a grown-up person. Politics involves compromise. It's the art of the possible. And there are some points at which you decide you'll chuck the whole thing in rather than go on. But I've fortunately never come to that position. I would have done if Tony had won the deputy leadership, and so would, I think, thousands of others.
Neil Kinnock was elected leader when Healy and Foote stood down after the Tory landslide in the '83 general election. A magnanimous Healy went to support Tony Benn, who was fighting a by-election to get back into the Commons, having lost his seat at the general election. Healy presented Benn, his bitterest Labour antagonist, as the man he couldn't do without.
In fact, I think Tony without Denis is like Torville without Dean.
My old man said, follow the tan, and don't fear Danny on the way.
On an official visit to Soviet Russia, Neil Kinnock and his shadow Foreign Secretary Denis Healey travelled with their wives on the train from Moscow to Leningrad.
When we were going on the great overnight express, and as we walked down the platform, Edna and Denis and Glenys and myself, the snow was falling, the steam was coming up from the heating system in the train, and I started whistling Lara's theme. Oh, that's right. You know, there was a very sudden snowfall. In London, about And it locked it immediately. Next thing I knew, Denis had taken off down the platform with Glenys waltzing. And so I asked Edna for the pleasure, and we all of us, the four of us, danced down the platform through the snow in the station in Moscow. That's an undying memory of Denis and Edna, who, of course, were a great, great, great partnership. Very sudden snow. In London, and it locked it up.
Denis Healey retired from frontline politics in 1992 and was made a baron. He'd become more popular with the public than he'd been with his party, aided by the impressions of Mike Yarwood.
And if you look at that screen, you'll see what I mean.
Well, Denis, I suppose you're wondering why I'm talking like this. Well, I've been imitating you for so long that I'm afraid your voice has become contagious. And my eyebrows have got a mind of their own as well. In fact, there are those who think that you're me and I'm you, but they're just silly billies.
I think I'll take these off now, actually. Oh, that hurt. To think you have to go through that every day.
Healey could now spend more time with his wife Edna. She'd become a successful biographer after having given up her own teaching career to support her husband and family.
He's basically an extraordinarily happy man. I mean, he does sing in the morning. Sometimes he's a little too boisterous for one's comfort.
Never. What a thing to say in front
he
of all
has
these
this
people.
enormous energy and vigor, women vigor.
Oh.
But he can be a little bit too rumbustious from time to time, but he's easy to live with. He's a very happy man, and it's a lovely, it's a lovely marriage, really.
Well, that's because I'm happily married.
Ah, isn't that nice?
2 decades after I'd filmed with the Healeys, I went back in 2013 to their house in Sussex to talk to the 95-year-old Lord Healy. I found him listening to his favourite music from his vast collection of CDs.
What would you put the secret of being happily
Well, we
married?
loved one another, as simple as that. And we shared the same love of music and poetry. And a pleasure shared with someone you love is a pleasure doubled, because you not only enjoy yourself, but you enjoy seeing your wife happy.
In 2010, shortly before their 65th wedding anniversary, Edna Healey had died in her sleep.
Well, it was terrible. Edna was half of my life, and when she died, that half, which was the better half, disappeared. But my family has kept me going, and my love of music and poetry keeps me going as well.
Healey's later life wasn't sedentary. He'd swim in his outdoor pool every day in the summer.
Every time I go in, I reckon to do 20 lengths. Once you're in the water, it's very easy. You can swim on your back, which is very comfortable.
Healey kept a shelf of latex mementos of his turbulent political life.
This is David Owen.
Yeah.
And he talks, not very clearly, but just a little bit. That is Neil Kinnock.
Kinocchio.
Very similar.
David Owen thought that in the end, say in 1980, that you didn't have the guts to take on the left wing of the party.
Absolute balls.
Why do you think David Owen says these kinds of
Well,
things?
he was a very self-centered person, actually. I mean, the interesting thing about him, as I wrote in my book, is that he was good-looking, he was intelligent, he had immense charm, and all these presents were given him by the good fairy,
And then the bad fairy came along and tapped him on the shoulder and said, "But you'll be a shit." And he was, of course. And he couldn't get on with anybody in the end, as you know.
In a house filled with books, Healy found that the ones he would return to again and again for consolation were the poets.
In terms of poems and poets, which mean the most to you now?
Well, Maggie Thatcher once said, "Every Prime Minister needs a Willie." She meant Willie Whitelaw, but many people misunderstood her. Well, I myself in politics have always had 4 Willies. William Shakespeare, William Blake, William Wordsworth, and William Butler Yeats. And each of them, in my mind, is absolutely wonderful. And I learned a lot of them by heart.
The 4 Willies all wrote powerfully about the great themes of life, love, and death.
Do you have a thought about death?
Not terribly keen on it. But no, I don't think about death at all, really.
Because some people do.
I know,
As
and I always remember when I was at EDNA's funeral, the clergyman said to me, "Well, don't worry, Dennis, you'll meet her again later." Well, I half believe that, because Edna to me is still up in the sky the whole time. But as I say, I don't believe in theology, but I do believe in the spirit. And what the spirit involves regarding death, much too early to say.
Denis Healey was sometimes described as the best Prime Minister Labour never had. Though he helped save Britain from bankruptcy, throughout his career his capacity to divide his party and country was greater than his ability to unite them. And while he would sometimes lose his temper, he never lost his talent to surprise.
I liked him for his courage, and I liked him for his warmth, and I liked him for this amazing hinterland, which made him a fascinating person to be with. And this love of the world outside politics also meant that there was always another life that he could think about, which was at least as attractive and probably more so than being Prime Minister.
Denis will always be remembered in British political history, not as a nearly man in a kind of sad way, but wouldn't it have been terrific man if he'd had a crack at the premiership?
Do you regret that you never became Prime Minister?
I do a little bit now. I never wanted to be Prime Minister at the time when I was in politics, because I wanted to do something rather than be something. But of course, Prime Ministers have to do a hell of a lot as well as being a lot. And I wish now that I had gone on.
There wasn't one moment you spent with Denis Healey that wasn't life-enhancing, even if you're going to get thumped on the way out. He'd punch you out of the... did it to me once, and out of the Chancellor's room in the Treasury. Right, now, sod off. Boom, 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 boom. Nobody else would have done that.
That's fine.
Denis Healey's last words to me, after we'd spent the afternoon filming with him at the age of 95, were, "Now you sod off," and I'll nod off.
Bye-bye.
I've been getting away